Hey gang, what's up? Today, before we begin into today's video, I'd like to talk about where we are now and what you can expect coming up with regards to my channel. So firstly, as you may have noticed, we have completed the sparring matches against QVM's Egg Infusion. I hope you really enjoyed the series. It was a blast to produce, and I'm sure QVM found it very interesting as well. And I think the most important thing is that it shows up one thing that this channel kind of lacks, which is competitive analysis. I'm kind of out of the competitive scene for now, so hopefully this gives you an insight as to what strong decks are out there right now. For the videos that are coming up, I have a couple of successful demos remaining that are lined up this coming week that will come out in time. Specifically, one of the cards is from Pack 2 and another card is from Pack 3. So what do you think that those cards are? You can leave your guesses in the comments, try to speculate and everything, but the whole point is we are going to clear all these backlog of successful demo videos before proceeding to Devil and the Dragon in Pack 4, which well, hasn't been implemented on the actual JNet, on the official JNet site yet, so it'll take a while. Coverage will probably begin in a week, but in the meantime, I'll look to get some games going with some of the new cards, and this is a good time for patrons to come message me with whatever comments or remarks you have on new cards. Maybe you have a certain opinion on some of the new cards, or maybe a new deck list that you want me to try out. Leave all these stuff in a PM. I will read every single one of them, and I would love to feature your thoughts, your opinions, your decks on my channel. Again, this is something I think I'm missing. A lot of the content is pushed out based on my own perception of the game. Everyone has different perspectives, and it would be nice to offer them up. I know I did this in the previous data pack, Pack 3, where I issued the Google Docs survey. The problem was that a lot of you gave me comments for cards that I have no intention of featuring, especially hate cards like No One Home and Reverse Infection. You all have so much good input, so many good things to say about these cards, and I really would love to feature them, but I'm just not going to do a successful demo on hate cards. That's not going to happen. So very unfortunate. Hopefully this new pack I can actually feature more of your comments. Again, my sincere apologies. Please don't feel like you wasted your time typing in your comments in those messages. I will do my best to try to feature them at some point in the future. But for now, we are going to head into Dumping Grounds, which is going to be today's content. I know this isn't a very popular segment, so I'm going to do something a little different this time. Instead of just showcasing decks, I'm going to do a bit more theory crafting. So to start off, this was actually the deck I intended to use for my successful demo of Nyx Sapphire, which came out in Council of the Crest. Specifically, this was actually suggested by one of my awesome patrons, Vadim Kasakov, in the aforementioned Council of the Crest Google Docs survey. I asked people for their suggestions on decks, and Vadim gave me a very good idea. He basically said, well, you sometime in the past when Asa came out, you've made this Kelly testing Asa deck on the left. That's the exact deck list I pushed out a while back. And they thought that it would be a really good idea to swap out the ice for the Nyx suite. And that got me thinking, because I looked at Vadim's deck list and it seems really solid. Like, I experienced pretty good success with the Kelly testing Asa back then, and now this seems like a straight up improvement, because Nyx Opal, Nyx Sapphire, they go very, very well in Kelly testing Asa. So yeah, I definitely thought that this was a brilliant idea and I was going to try it out. But given that it's on Dumping Grounds, you know something went wrong somewhere. Can you see what's wrong with the new Asa Spam deck on the right? That's the one that Vadim proposed compared to the one that I used to play on the left. Well, to be complete, I mean, this is nothing against Vadim at all, because I must admit, I thought this deck proposed by Vadim was brilliant. I thought there was nothing wrong with it. I thought it would be pretty powerful. It turns out that playing these decks is still very important, because in my theory crafting world, Asa Spam 2 looks perfect, but when I brought it to the table, well, let's watch the video. Alright, as you may have inferred from looking at the deck list, our restricted slot is Estelle Moon for a reason. She's the workhorse of this deck. economically and in terms of draw. So, you know, an opening hand with a bunch of ice to protect Estelle Moon seems pretty good. And we start getting the Estelle Moon rolling. So, one really nice thing about the Nyx Ice is that they synergize very well with Estelle Moon. You protect her, and chances are that the runner just simply cannot afford to face check. I mean, if they're lucky, they'll get away with an end run on Nyx Silver. But if they're unlucky, I could easily fire off a Nyx Opal or a Nyx Sapphire, both of which deal some heavy damage before they get into the Estelle Moon server. Opal in particular allows you to, you know, regurgitate cards from your hand onto the table before popping Estelle Moon for extra counters. And Nyx Sapphire obviously is a huge trigger, allowing you to control the flow of agendas and everything. So here you'll just see me continue installing a whole bunch of assets. We are up to 4 counters on Estelle Moon, and we're going to protect the Jeeves Motor Bioroids with Nyx Silver because it's a very key card in scoring our 4-2 agendas. Now, because this isn't CI, Estelle Moon is not something you want to let get tick up too much. 4 counters is just about at the limit, because any more than that and you'll start flooding your hand with too many cards. So this seemed like a perfect time to pop it, because I had only 2 cards in my hand. Now I have 6. A lot of options here, a good amount of money. With 2 team sponsorships on the table, I decided this was the perfect time to fast advance with Arceus' ability. Using a candy testing out of hand, I'm able to fast advance the Vitruvius, putting me on the table, but more importantly, triggering 2 team sponsorships for some money in advanced lines and the Estelle Moon. Because they share the same simultaneous trigger with no paid ability windows in between. I'm not able to res the Estelle Moon before resing before installing the advanced assembly line, so I wasn't able to get an extra counter of Estelle Moon for the AAL. So, this is the point of the game where things started turning south. My opponent installs an Omaqua, goes to ham on my remotes, and now hits HQ. I had a Nyx Opal on HQ, right? And Nyx Opal was pretty useless there. I could res it, I could install one of my cards, but, you know, they had remaining clicks, so I couldn't install the Vitruvius safely in the remote. They went to contest my Estelle Moon after I res an Architect, but Architect was pretty easy for them to break with MK Ultra. So here I was trying to push out my Nyx agenda since I was starting to get flooded here. And Ice into Architect should hopefully keep my opponent at bay. They run HQ again, and again I can't res the Opal, because if I install the Vitruvius here, I can't defend it. I could install the Vitruvius and the Sapphire, but what would that do? They would run it, and they would steal the agenda all the same. So I had to concede my second Vitruvius to my opponent there, because the HQ Ice was useless. And that's basically Nyx Opal in a nutshell. It just really isn't that good. It's really dependent on what you have in your hand, and sometimes it just, you know, doesn't do enough. So I do get to score my third Vitruvius. Thankfully, my opponent did not check the Architect server, so I get another 2 team spawn triggers, this time triggering it for Estelle Moon and Jeeves in their respective servers. But now they're starting to run R&D, and guess what? I have no credits. And this is where I'm starting to look at my old list and wish I had the old Ice Suite with Vanillas and Fairchild 1s. You know, it would have been a lot easier to tax my opponent on remotes and on centrals. But right now, my opponent is just waltzing through HQ and R&D as though there are no ice there. I can't afford to rest the ice. I spent too much tempo scoring 2 Vitruviuses with no payback whatsoever. My opponent is now running my Estelle Moon, a very smart move, because I'm on no credits, I can't threaten any ice. The Architect breaks, and do I pop the Moon here? I kind of have to. Not very good. But they accidentally let me fire Architect here. I think they were a credit short or something. Yes, they were a credit short because they needed to be able to threaten to trash the Estelle Moon. So actually, I was able to install a bunch of cards here. So my opponent throwing me a bone there, but not enough of a bone to keep my central safe, as they start hammering my R&D, trashing an Ultraviolet Clearance, one of the big cards that could potentially get me back some tempo. Now they are trashing my assets left, right, center. I lose my moons, and I'm forced to click for credits here and play the Ultraviolet next turn, assuming my opponent doesn't trash the Ultraviolet that's in my hand now. We are up against Edward Kim. Yeah, things are looking really dicey. So I tried to threaten an Estelle Moon in the remote again. Hopefully they won't run HQ to trash my Ultraviolet, so, you know, distract them off server 1. This is what the Arceus spam deck is supposed to do, you know, install a bunch of remotes, hopefully they get distracted, but nope, they're running my HQ here. And oh, thankfully they can't hammer my ultraviolet here because they hammered a hedge fund of R&D. So I do get the UVC off, and I get to install off the UVC. I very much want the daily business show, but I figured that Chronos project is the way to go here. So I installed the Chronos project with an additional piece of ice. And here you see the second downside of Nyx Ice. This deck is perpetually poor because it runs so many small economy cards and is too busy advancing agendas. You don't have the money to res ice. Again, this is why Fairchild 1 and Vanilla are just better. If you can't res ice here, your next ice suddenly look a lot worse. You look at the next silver on R&D right now. How much does it tax the runner for? 1 credit. How much did it cost for me to res it? 3. That's a very bad trade for me. And that's the problem with the next ice suite. If you can't afford to res all of your ice, what's the point? Right? I'm trying to get the ice all res here so that the next will start becoming taxing. I can get more and more res next ice on the table, but it's very slow, and I'm down to 2 credits again just to defend this Chronos project, which my opponent now steals, putting them up on 6 points. Yeah, this is looking like a pretty difficult game to win. We are both on match point technically, but I need to score an Ikawa to win, while my opponent just needs any other agenda. Speaking of an Ikawa, there's one in my hand right now, and it's not looking safe at all. So yeah, next ice is not that good in a horizontal deck because, okay, I guess it can be used in a horizontal deck if you can induce your opponent into running lots of servers as I did here. But the reason I was able to induce my opponent into running R&D and HQ so much was actually because I was so poor most of the game, right? So if I were richer, you know, it would be a different game. My opponent wouldn't be playing so aggressively. They have to respect the more painful pieces of ice and respect the fact that I can get lots of next ice res. Next ice is a lot better in vertical decks where in one single run you can potentially res multiple next ice and immediately get them up to a critical mass. So that is the main problem with jamming next ice in an acid spam deck. It just doesn't work that well, even though the subroutines are very conducive for Estelle Moon. Estelle Moon loves it when you fire off next opals or next sapphires, but when it comes to the Asa spam here, it's just not rich enough to support the next ice suite because you want to be resing all of your ice, and this is the main problem that I found with this deck that you don't see at first glance because there are lots of money cards in this deck. I think it was like 9 to 12 economy cards. You would think it's enough, but it was barely enough to res my assets. You know, these assets are expensive to res. Jeeves is expensive. Business show is expensive. Team sponsorship costs money. I just didn't have the money to res the ice. And now I finally get to res my opal here, but isn't it a bit too late at this point? Yeah, so yeah, the whole point of resing the opal here was just to get the next ice count up to 3. There was nothing in my hand worth installing. In fact, I didn't want my opponent to hammer my ultraviolet. But resing it put me down to 2 credits here. You see, now I'm forced to res all the next silvers. I'm getting a bunch of silvers off, and they are now getting to the point where they're taxing enough. But it's too late because by this point, I'm super poor, while my opponent has very good economy rolling with the 2 underworld contacts with the Beth. Well, the Beth is not paying off. I'm super poor this game, but you get the idea. They can just run centrals to their heart's content. Even though there are 3 next ice res, it's not doing much. So I think one of the remotes down there is the Ikawa. I've installed it naked, and I think my opponent didn't check it, but we are in a very awkward spot where I need to get up to, I believe, 8 credits plus having a res Jeeves in order to score the Ikawa from Never Advanced State. Meanwhile, they can just keep hammering my centrals. Of course, at this point, they don't know that I'm actually getting pretty close to victory, but if they hammer the Baltic out of my hand, you know, I'm also screwed as well. And yep, they find the winning agenda there. So I know I've said this a million times, but it bears repeating. This deck is just too poor to support the next ice suite, and it's not just the deck list itself, but also the deck archetype. Next ice isn't very good in a rush setting because yeah, it just doesn't fulfill the requirements of rush ice, that is to gear check the opponent early and to tax them as the game goes on. I mean, next ice does that in theory, but in practice only one of the next ice actually ends the run, and you really won't be able to get it to critical mass before the runner gets set up, and that's the big problem. It just doesn't text sufficiently in the most important stage of the game, the early game. That is when you set up your board and the team sponsorships allow you to roll out of control. That didn't really happen this game. My opponent was able to suppress the G's Motobioroids, kept running my Estelle Moons. As such, I was not able to establish a foothold. I spent most of the game clicking for credits, which, well, your deck is losing if you're clicking for credits. This Asa Spam deck is meant to roll forward with its own momentum, not click for credits. That is losing tempo. So yeah, this deck basically at the end of the day has too much draw and not enough money. That's not to say that Vadim's idea is a bad one. I must say, I must thank Vadim very much for actually bringing this up as a suggestion, because as I mentioned, I myself did not see a problem with the deck at all until I played with it. That unveiled all its downsides to me. So this just goes to show how important it is to playtest a deck, because it might look like, you know, cherry blossoms and rainbows in theory crafting, but when you actually get down to it, it just cannot hold its own. Still, because of that, I want to thank Vadim, because this is a very good lesson that everyone can learn from. Now let's move on to another deck. I also wanted to do a successful demo on Marathon. Unfortunately, it fell flat. Firstly, I want to also, showcase one of my and other patrons' comments on Marathon. This one was from Black Lion Chess, who mentioned that Marathon features amazing legal card art, which I 100% agree with. I absolutely love this pouncing kitty cat and how it is accentuated by the different color palette. Mechanically, Black Lion Chess hit it on the head by saying that Marathon becomes powerful when you combine it with run-based effects. It's pretty mediocre by itself. Most games are only running remotes a couple of times, and each time you run with Marathon, you gain an extra click, but you're also losing 1 credit for playing the card itself. So the gain's actually pretty marginal. What you really want to do is to have Marathon synergize with run-based effects. So I can think of a lot of them off the top of my head from the various factions. Adam, it synergizes very well because you, if you start with always be running as your directive, Marathon allows you to click 1 run and regain your click. So you have 4 clicks remaining for your turn instead of 3. It's very nice and of course reusable. So, you know, you can pretty much mitigate the downside of always be running, sapping a click every single turn. Anox can use Marathon to synergize with the run-based viruses that are getting printed this cycle. It seems like viruses now trigger off successful runs to gain virus counters. Marathon can help with that. And of course, who can forget the run-based faction, or what used to be the run-based faction in Criminal. Marathon in run-based Kentama would be very strong because it gives you a reliable way in which to proc your ID ability, reliably giving you 1 credit every turn. If you have public terminals installed, all the better, because then you don't have to offset the play cost of Marathon as well. So yeah, a lot of good uses for Marathon. Of course, the problem is Marathon is 5 influence. These users don't really justify paying 5 influence for this card. I mean, it's a good card, don't get me wrong, but it just doesn't give enough oomph to justify 5 influence out of Adam, Anarch, or Criminal, which means we're basically forced to play it in Shaper. And I did have an idea for it. Marathon in Smoke can do some wonders. It charges Netrunner because it's a run, and it also triggers Find the Truth. Admittedly, it would be better in Adam. Adam would really appreciate Marathon to trigger Find the Truth, but in Smoke, well, we can live with that. The problem was that Marathon in Smoke was underwhelming against corps without open remotes. You are rarely ever playing your Marathon, and even when you are, you're not getting those... you're not getting much value out of it. It really, against a Glacier deck, for example, you run the remote maybe 3 or 4 times a game, I should say. That's not a lot of gain from Marathon. There are lots of other cards that are competing for the 40 deck size deck that's associated with Smoke. Against Acid Spam, on the other hand, you would much rather have Astrolabe. Even though you can check all the remotes with Marathon, you are just much better off, you know, insta-drawing your entire deck with Astrolabe and then just winning off centrals. So my final conclusion was that Marathon is not playable right now simply because it was printed in the wrong faction with a way too high influence cost. Marathon feels like a Criminal card an Adam card, maybe an Anarch card, but instead was put in the one faction that has the least use for it, and thus becomes a very underwhelming card. What a pity. So that's all we have for Dumping Grounds. It's a relatively short episode in terms of number of decks, but I want to move on to talk about an announcement regarding the Sparring Cube. This is something that I introduced during the Sparring League Finals. The Teaching League Finals, I should say. And yeah, this is basically the successor to the Sparring decks. So if you didn't watch that video where I introduced it, basically I want to have a curated environment for newer players to, spar against each other with fun balanced decks while learning how to play good Netrunner. Above that, this Sparring Cube actually gives another degree of freedom in that players can now deck build to some extent. How this works is I'll be giving each faction a list of cards. Here's an example of the Shaper deck that I'm planning to introduce. So the Shaper faction can use all these cards in this column. All remaining cards in the card pool are illegal. And you can include as many or as few of each card as you like. So you can include 0 Proco, for example. You can include the maximum number of career fare if you want. Or you can include any number, you can include 1 legwork, you can use 2 or 3 legwork, whatever. As long as your final deck adheres with standard deck building restrictions, has the correct number of total cards, number of influence, and doesn't use more than 1 restricted card, you're all good to go. So, through this Sparring Cube, what I really hope is that players can get a taste of deck building and have some meaningful decisions in the deck building phase. For example, this kit deck allows you to decide between 2 different breaker suites. You can go for a static breaker suite in Nanotke, Paperclip, breakers that do work once they are installed. However, it's going to cost more influence. The Paperclip costs 3 influence. Or you can go for the more the breaker suite with more moving parts, like Cerberus. It only has 4 counters, so you need to run Scavenge to refresh it. And Scavenge also really helps with getting your Femme Fatale in play, because you can scavenge a test run Femme to cheat the Femme in for free. So you can choose between these 2 breaker suites. One costs more influence, the other one is more combo-y. And through this, I hope players will get a taste of what deck building is like, and get to build decks that they themselves enjoy, or find combos that work, which is pretty cool, in a curated environment, so that these newer players are not overwhelmed by the sheer number of cards in the current card pool. It must be very difficult to deck build when you don't know half the cards that exist and the combos that are possible. By limiting the available number of cards to this many, hopefully players are more well acquainted with the cards and can make more informed deck building choices. You'll also notice that instead of segregating cards based on the type, event, hardware, program, instead I am categorizing them by their function. We have econ cards, you have draw cards, you have breakers, and of course the subtypes, in case you're not familiar with these breakers, and of course some utility cards. What I want to do with this is to let players understand that it's important to maintain a good balance of econ, draw, and breakers. Identifying the functions of cards is quite important, because that's how you get a good consistency in your deck. If you have only 3 draw cards in your deck, for example, you can be sure that you won't find the rest of your deck very easily, because you'll be clicking to draw a lot more often. So, by breaking down cards like this, hopefully it makes it easier to deck build, and also easier to decide which cards are up for replacement. Which cards can you replace given the current deck list? Yeah, there's definitely a sample deck list here that you can follow. There's 45 cards, so you don't have to do any deck building. But if you wanted to, for example, perhaps you can switch out the utility cards, like swapping a utility No One Home for a utility Utopia Shard. That's a 1-for-1 trade that you can do, because they share the same function but do different things. So that's basically what I'm trying to aim at when introducing this Sparring Cube. The last thing you'll notice is that obviously we are using Google Sheets instead of Netrunner DB, a very unconventional way to deck build, but there are two reasons why I chose this. Firstly, it allows me to classify cards by their category, which Netrunner DB doesn't support. You know, I can label cards as econ and draw. The second important reason is because it's much easier to deck build from a player's perspective on the sheet due to the nature of the format. If you're deck building in Netrunner DB, for example, you're building the Shaper deck and you're wondering, I want to include, say, I don't know, say, Liberator accounts in my deck. But is it in the list of legal cards? I don't know. I need to cross-reference with some printed list or something. And that takes time. That is very, you know, not user-friendly, I should say. Netrunner DB cannot give you an indication of whether a card is in the Sparring Cube list or not. So this is why I rather have it as a Google Sheets. That way you can see at a glance which cards are legal and build off there. So what I'm looking for by introducing this on my channel are suggestions and criticisms to this format. Do you think this is a good format? Is there anything I can improve on? Do you think the lists are balanced? Do you think there are certain cards that should or should not be in the list? Let me know all your comments, because I'm still in the phase of designing this Sparring Cube. So anything goes. I'm happy to listen to suggestions, and a lot of things are open for change. I'll leave a link to the Google Sheets that contains the current decks, current cubes in the description, so that you can have a look at them and maybe even build your own decks from them. Let me know what you think, because all feedback is very much appreciated. In the meantime, as always, thanks for watching. Happy net running. I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.